The call came on a Tuesday, cleaving through the sterile hum of Leo Maxwell's downtown San Francisco office like a shard of glass. It was a lawyer with a voice as dry as old parchment informing him that Alistair, the grandfather he hadn't seen in 15 years, was dead. The man had died as he had lived, alone, on a sprawling patch of unincorporated land in the densest part of Oregon. Leo's first emotion wasn't grief, but a profound, weary annoyance. It was a logistical problem, a messy inheritance that would disrupt his meticulously scheduled life of code sprints and investor meetings. "He left you everything, Mr. Maxwell," the lawyer droned. "The property, the accounts, the contents of the house. It's all yours." Leo booked a flight for Thursday. He imagined a quaint, dilapidated cabin he could flip in a month, a quick injection of cash to pour into his startup. The drive from the tiny regional airport was a descent into another world. Paved roads gave way to gravel, then to a dirt track that clawed its way through a claustrophobic forest of Douglas firs and ancient cedars. The trees stood so thick they blotted out the sun, plunging the road into a perpetual twilight. His cell service had vanished an hour ago. For the first time, a flicker of unease, cold and sharp, cut through his irritation. The property wasn't a cabin. It was a fortress. The two-story house was built from thick, dark timber and local stone, with narrow windows that looked more like arrow slits. It was encircled by a 10-foot-high fence made of sharpened logs, formidable enough to repel a battering ram. A heavy, iron-strapped gate blocked the entrance. It took Leo a solid 10 minutes to wrestle with the massive, rusted padlock, the key for which the lawyer had sent in a padded envelope. The air was heavy with the scent of pine, damp earth, and something else. Something wild and musky, like a large animal's den. Inside, the house was a paradox. It was rustic but impeccably clean. A massive stone fireplace dominated the main room, its mantel cluttered not with family photos, but with polished stones and intricate star charts. The furniture was heavy, handmade oak, but the modern world had intruded in strange ways. On the roof, Leo had spotted 2 large solar panels, and a low, persistent hum from a shed out back suggested a powerful diesel generator. This place was designed for self-sufficiency, for isolation. It was built to keep the world out, or perhaps to keep something in. The library was where the strangeness coalesced. One wall was floor-to-ceiling shelves, but they held no novels or popular histories. Instead, there were leather-bound tomes with titles like Compendium of Lunar Phases, Nocturnal Apex Predators of the Pacific Northwest, and The Great Migration, a cartographic survey. Detailed topographical maps of the surrounding wilderness were pinned to a massive corkboard, marked with cryptic symbols and handwritten notes in Alistair's spidery script. Routes were traced through impassable mountains and dense, unmapped forests. Then he saw it, sitting alone on Alistair's huge oak desk. It was a journal, but like no journal Leo had ever seen. It was the size of a family Bible, bound not in leather but in dark, pitted iron plates, held together with thick rivets. A complex lock, looking more like a piece of medieval machinery than a simple clasp, secured it shut. There was no key for this on the ring the lawyer had provided. It felt impossibly heavy in his hands, cold and foreboding. An aura of immense age and secrecy radiated from it. Leo ran a hand over the cold metal. What kind of man builds a fortress in the middle of nowhere and keeps his diary in an iron box? His initial plan to photograph the property for a real estate listing and leave felt laughably naive. He felt like a man who had stumbled upon the edge of a map where the familiar world ended, and the cartographer had simply written, "Here be monsters." He spent the rest of the day exploring the house, his unease growing with every discovery. The kitchen pantry was stocked with enough canned goods to survive a nuclear winter. In a back room, he found 2 industrial-grade chest freezers, both humming quietly. He lifted the lid of one. It was packed solid with butchered game, deer, elk, even what looked like a small bear, all wrapped neatly in white paper. The generator outside must have an automatic starter, he realized, kicking in to keep the temperature stable. His grandfather had prepared for a siege. Near the generator shed, Leo found a clipboard hanging on a nail. A fuel delivery receipt was clipped to it, dated just a month ago. It seemed Alistair had a standing, no-questions-asked contract with a fuel company from the nearest town for semi-annual diesel deliveries. The old man had automated his own isolation. As night fell, the forest pressed in, the silence absolute and unnerving. Leo built a fire in the hearth, the flames casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the walls. He sat with the iron journal in his lap, turning it over and over. He felt a primal pull toward it, a sense of destiny that terrified his logical, ordered mind. This wasn't just a house. It was a responsibility. An inheritance of secrets he was only beginning to comprehend. Outside, a lone wolf howled, the sound closer than he would have liked. And it felt less like a cry of nature and more like a greeting, or a warning. The basement was the last place Leo explored, and he'd been putting it off. The door, a slab of heavy oak at the back of the kitchen, seemed to suck the warmth from the room. He descended a set of steep stone steps into a space that smelled of damp earth, mildew, and something else. A faint metallic tang like old blood. The air was frigid, a stark contrast to the fire-warmed house above. A single bare bulb cast a weak yellow circle of light, leaving the corners in deep shadow. The space was more of a root cellar than a basement. Shelves lined one wall, holding dusty jars of preserves. The floor was packed earth, and the walls were rough-hewn stone. It felt ancient, a part of the hill the house was built on. Leo ran his hand along the far wall, his fingers tracing the cold, damp stone. He was about to turn back when he noticed it, a subtle, almost imperceptible draft tickling the back of his neck. He held up his hand. Nothing. He took a step to the left, and there it was again, a faint current of air where none should be. He pushed against the stone wall. It was solid. He pushed again, lower this time. His fingers found a seam, a hairline crack he'd missed in the gloom. He pressed harder, his shoulder digging into the rough surface. With a low groan of grinding stone, a section of the wall pivoted inward, revealing a dark, cavernous space beyond. The air that billowed out was stale and intensely cold, carrying a dry, dusty scent of hibernation. It was a hidden chamber about 15 feet square, its walls and floor made of smooth, dressed stone, unlike the rough cellar. And in the center of the room stood the source of the house's deep, unsettling secret. 12 of them. They stood in a circle, motionless, their forms draped in a century's worth of dust and cobwebs. At first he thought they were macabre statues, a bizarre art installation left by his eccentric grandfather. They were humanoid, with long limbs and gaunt frames, their heads bowed as if in prayer. Their skin was the color of old parchment, stretched tight over bone and sinew. They were utterly still, caught in a state of suspended animation. In the center of the circle was a pedestal, and on it sat a strange device. It looked like a brass astrolabe, with interlocking rings and gears, all focused on a large, milky white crystal at its core. A faint, silvery light pulsed from the crystal, a slow, rhythmic beat, like a sleeping heart. Wires, thick as his thumb, ran from the base of the device and disappeared into the stone floor beneath each of the 12 figures. Leo stepped closer, his breath fogging in the frigid air. He was a creature of logic and code, but this defied all explanation. It was a scene from a nightmare, a tomb sealed away from the world. He reached out, his curiosity overriding his fear, and touched one of the brass rings on the central device. It was a fatal mistake. The moment his skin made contact, a jolt of energy, cold and sharp, shot up his arm. The crystal on the pedestal flared with a blinding silver-white light, and the rhythmic pulse stopped. A deep, resonant thrum echoed through the chamber, and then silence. A profound, terrifying silence. He had broken something. He had turned off a switch he didn't understand. A sound made him freeze. A dry, rasping crack like old wood snapping. It came from one of the figures, then another, and another. Dust cascaded from their shoulders as, one by one, they began to stir. Necks, locked in place for decades, slowly, audibly began to lift. A low, guttural growl, little more than a vibration in the chest, rumbled from the nearest figure. Leo watched in pure, unadulterated horror as the transformation began. The parchment-like skin split and tore, not with blood, but with a dry, tearing sound. Beneath it, thick, coarse fur, black, gray, and brown, sprouted in dense patches. Muscles, dormant for an age, bunched and swelled with terrifying speed, shredding the thin layer of preserved flesh. Their skeletons reconfigured with a symphony of sickening cracks and pops, spines elongated, forcing them into a hunched predatory crouch, shoulders broadened, and arms thickened into powerful forelegs, their faces pushed forward, bones shifting and reshaping into elongated muzzles. Teeth, yellow and blunt, fell away as sharp white fangs descended from their gums. Their quiet, human-like forms erupted into something vast and monstrous. Within a minute, the 12 dusty figures were gone. In their place stood a pack of 12 enormous bipedal wolves, each standing over 7 feet tall even in their hunched posture. Their eyes, now open, glowed with a feral yellow light in the gloom. Hot, steamy breath plumed from their snarling maws, carrying the scent of a predator's hunger. They were all muscle and fur and claw, perfect killing machines awakened from a timeless slumber. Leo was paralyzed, his back pressed against the stone wall, his mind screaming. This couldn't be real. It was a hallucination, a stress-induced psychotic break. But the low, menacing growls that filled the chamber were real. The sight of their chests heaving with breath was real. The primal terror that had seized his very soul was real. He had not inherited a house. He had inherited a crypt, and he had just opened the door. Trapped in the crypt, Leo Maxwell felt his life spooling out to a final bloody end. The 12 werewolves stood fully formed, a ring of hulking muscle and predatory instinct. The air was thick with their scent, a potent mix of damp fur, earth, and a raw, animalistic power that made the hair on his arms stand on end. Their collective gaze was fixed on him, their yellow eyes glowing with an unnerving intelligence. He expected a chaotic, frenzied attack, a tearing of limb from limb. Instead, they watched him. There was no immediate aggression, no snarling lunge. There was an unnerving stillness, an appraisal. But beneath it, he felt something else. A wave of sensation that washed over him, not as a thought, but as a physical feeling. It was hunger. A deep, gnawing, cavernous emptiness that seemed to emanate from them and resonate within his own bones. It was a hunger that had lasted for decades, a starvation so profound it had become a part of their being. Slowly, One of the werewolves detached itself from the circle and padded toward him. It was a she-wolf, the largest of the pack. Her fur was a mix of silver and black, her frame massive, but carrying an air of lean, experienced grace. Her eyes, a piercing amber, held not malice, but a deep, weary wisdom. This was the one who had howled in the forest. He knew it instinctively. This was their leader. Leo flattened himself against the stone, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The she-wolf stopped a few feet from him. Her massive head was level with his chest. He could feel the heat radiating from her body, see the condensation of her breath. She lowered her head, exposing the thick, powerful muscles of her neck in a gesture of submission. A jolt went through Leo, a sudden, inexplicable understanding that bypassed language and logic entirely. It was a whisper in his blood, a genetic memory awakening. Alistair's blood runs in your veins. The Keeper's blood. It was more than a thought. It was a physical resonance. A low thrum started deep in his chest, a vibration that seemed to echo the very stone of the crypt. For a fleeting second he felt an urge to speak, not with his own voice, but with something older, something that rumbled with the weight of mountains. They weren't seeing him, Leo the software developer. They were smelling his lineage. They recognized him. He was not their prey. He was their alpha. The she-wolf, whose name bloomed in his mind as if it had always been there, Vexa, let out a low whine. It was a sound of fealty, but also of desperate appeal. He could feel it again, stronger now. Their shared agony of starvation, their bodies, newly awakened, were consuming themselves. They were dying. The realization snapped him out of his terror and into a state of frantic, problem-solving clarity. He was their alpha. He was responsible for them. And his first duty was to feed his pack. "Food," he croaked, his voice raw. "Wait here." He wasn't sure if they understood the word, but they understood the intent. He backed away slowly, turned, and scrambled up the basement stairs, his mind racing. The freezers. The goddamn freezers full of meat. He burst into the kitchen, his hands shaking as he fumbled for the light switch. He ran to the back room, the low hum of the generator a reassuring sound. He threw open the lid of the first industrial freezer. The sight of the neatly wrapped packages of venison and elk, which had seemed morbidly strange an hour ago, now looked like salvation. But there was no time for thawing. He hauled out a huge frozen haunch of deer, the block of ice and meat weighing at least 60 pounds. It was so cold it burned his hands. He dragged it across the floor and kicked it down the basement stairs, where it landed with a heavy, solid thud. He went back for more, his muscles straining, his mind a whirlwind. He shoved another deer quarter, then a massive rack of elk ribs down into the darkness. He crept to the top of the stairs and peered down. The scene below was one of savage, desperate relief. The pack had fallen upon the frozen meat, their powerful jaws making short work of the ice-hard flesh. The air was filled with the sounds of cracking bone and the tearing of sinew. It wasn't a meal, it was a reclamation of life. Vexa, the beta of the pack, stood back for a moment, watching her kin, before tearing off a huge piece for herself. She looked up at Leo, her amber eyes meeting his, and in them he saw a flicker of gratitude, of acceptance. He had bought himself time. He had bought their trust. Leo slumped against the kitchen wall, sliding to the floor, his body trembling with the adrenaline crash. He looked at his hands, ordinary and soft. An alpha. He was the leader of a pack of werewolves. His grandfather hadn't been a reclusive eccentric. He was a warden, a keeper. The fortified house, the lunar charts, the generator ensuring the freezers never failed. It was all part of a system. A system designed to keep this pack safe, dormant, and fed. A system that he had just broken and now had to rebuild from scratch. His gaze fell on the iron-bound journal, still sitting on the desk where he'd left it. It was no longer just a curiosity. It was a manual, a rule book, the key to understanding the nightmare he had inherited. With a deep, shuddering breath, Leo pushed himself to his feet and walked toward it. The long, terrifying night had just begun. The hours after the feeding were a tense truce with reality. Leo sat at the heavy oak desk, the iron-bound journal before him, while the sounds of the pack settling drifted up from the open basement door. Low growls, the soft thud of heavy bodies lying down, the occasional snap of a bone. He had managed to pry open the journal's complex lock with a combination of tools from his grandfather's workshop, revealing pages of dense, spidery handwriting. It was a chronicle, a bestiary, and a book of laws all in one. He learned they were not the cursed victims of a bite, but a bloodline, an ancient subspecies of humanity that carried the wolf within. His grandfather's role as keeper was to provide a sanctuary to guide them and to enforce the one, absolute law that ensured their survival: shed no human blood. But the journal also spoke of their nature, of the primal, insatiable hunger that a full moon or the scent of fresh blood could ignite. Down in the crypt, that hunger was a simmering fire. While most of the pack, weak from their long sleep, were sated by the frozen game, for one, it was an insult. His name was Fen, a young male with fur the color of rust and eyes that burned with impatient fire. He was younger than the others, born into the pack shortly before their long slumber, and he remembered the thrill of a real hunt, the taste of warm, living flesh. The thawed, bloodless meat they'd been given was a pale imitation. It quieted the ache in his belly but did nothing to soothe the screaming of his instincts. He watched Leo from the shadows of the basement, a strange, soft creature who smelled of the keeper but lacked his presence, his strength. This new alpha was weak, a city dweller who flinched at the sound of their feeding. Fen felt a curl of contempt. The old ways were better. The old ways were stronger. As the moon climbed high in the sky, casting silver beams through the narrow windows of the house, the urge became unbearable. Vexa lay nearby, her breathing deep and even. The others were stirring in a sort of meat-induced torpor. Leo was still upstairs, lost in the old keeper's book. No one would notice. The command to stay had been an unspoken one, a general sense of containment. It wasn't a direct order from the Alpha. Not yet. That was a loophole Fen's predatory mind was more than willing to exploit. Silent as a shadow, he slipped up the stone steps. He moved with a fluid grace that belied his size, his claws clicking softly on the wooden floor of the kitchen. He saw the Alpha, his back to him, completely absorbed. A predatory smile stretched Fen's muzzle, so fragile. He slunk out the back door, which Leo had left ajar, and vaulted the log fence with effortless power. The night air was intoxicating, filled with the rich tapestry of scents he had been denied for so long. The aroma of pine needles, damp earth, and most powerfully of life. About 2 miles east, carried on the breeze, was the scent of livestock. Warm, breathing, bleating. The Miller farm was a small, family-run operation. A few dozen sheep, a handful of dairy cows. Fen moved through the trees like a ghost, a rust-colored blur against the dark trunks. He cleared the farm's simple wire fence in a single bound, landing silently in the pasture. The cows shifted uneasily, their lowing laced with panic. They smelled a predator unlike any they had ever known. Fen didn't stalk. He didn't play with his food. This was not about strategy. It was about release. He burst from the tree line, a whirlwind of claws and fangs, and slammed into the largest cow. The impact sent the half-ton animal stumbling. There was a brief, terrified bellow, cut short by a sound of tearing flesh. It was a brutal, frenzied explosion of pent-up violence. Fen was lost in the red haze of the kill, the warm, metallic taste of blood flooding his senses, a glorious antidote to the frozen fare back at the sanctuary. The next morning, Leo was woken not by the sun, but by the blare of the television. He'd fallen asleep at the desk, the journal open under his cheek. He stumbled into the main room, where he'd left the small TV on, and the local news channel filled the screen. A scene of shocking carnage at the Miller farm, just west of town, a grim-faced anchorwoman was saying. The screen cut to shaky, handheld footage. A local reporter stood in a field, her expression horrified. Behind her, the source of her distress was laid bare. A Holstein cow lay eviscerated, its flank ripped open in a way that defied explanation. The ground around it was churned into a muddy, bloody mess. "Authorities are baffled," the reporter said, her voice tight. Sheriff Miller, no relation to the farm's owners, stated that no known predator in this region, not a cougar, not a bear, is capable of this kind of savagery. Then the camera zoomed in, and Leo's blood ran cold. The cameraman focused on a set of tracks in the muddy earth next to the carcass. They were not hoof prints or bear tracks. They were massive canine-like prints, but far too large for any wolf. They were the prints of a monster. His monster. Leo looked toward the basement door. He could feel a change in the pack's mood below. The scent of fresh blood, carried on Fen's fur, had electrified the air, stirring the dormant hunger in the others. He heard a low, challenging growl from the darkness. Fen was back, and he had just painted a target on all their backs. The small, isolated world of Alistair's farm had been breached. Fen hadn't just killed a cow. He had sent up a flare. Hundreds of miles away, in a sterile, climate-controlled office building nestled in the Nevada desert, an algorithm flagged the story. It wasn't the headline, "Livestock mutilation baffles Oregon authorities." That triggered the alert. It was a combination of keywords: unprecedented savagery, non-native predator, and the geographic coordinates of the Miller farm. The system cross-referenced this with a proprietary database of historical incidents and a network of quiet informants, one of whom was a clerk in the local Oregon Sheriff's Office who had texted a photo of the strange tracks for a small fee. The alert appeared on a hardened tablet belonging to a man named Silas. He was the CEO and field commander of a private security firm known in the shadowy circles of the ultra-wealthy and occult underground as the Order of Scavengers. They weren't mystics or crusaders. They were pragmatists, ex-special forces operators and ruthless mercenaries who had found a niche and uniquely profitable market, hunting and eradicating supernatural biological entities. Werewolves, or as their internal literature called them, lupine sapiens, were their specialty. Their pelts, fangs, and claws fetched astronomical prices on the black market, sold to collectors who desired the ultimate trophy or to esoteric groups who believed in their alchemical properties. Silas was a man sculpted from ice and discipline. His face was a mask of cold professionalism, his eyes the color of a winter sky. He looked at the grainy photo of the paw print on his tablet, his expression unchanging. He didn't see a monster. He saw a product. More than that, he saw a signature. He swiped to an archival file, one labeled Sanctuary 12, Alistair Kane. It contained decades of surveillance data, satellite images of the fortified farm, thermal scans that showed a dozen heat signatures in the basement going cold years ago, and a psychological profile of the old keeper. "He's dead," Silas said to the empty room, his voice a flat, toneless statement of fact. The old man finally died. Alistair had been a nuisance, a formidable protector who had kept his specimens perfectly contained. The scavengers had a policy of not engaging with stable populations. It was bad for business. A direct assault was costly and risked damaging the merchandise. They preferred to be what their name implied, scavengers who moved in after a system had failed. And this was a catastrophic system failure. The livestock kill was sloppy, a sign of a newly awakened, undisciplined pack. The old keeper was gone, and a new alpha, or worse, no alpha, was in charge. An uncontrolled pack was a liability, but also an opportunity. A dozen prime specimens suddenly on the loose. It was the score of a lifetime. He tapped a comms link on his tablet. "Marcus Prep Strike Team Alpha. Full loadout. Silver core rounds, UV flares, motion trackers with biometric filters. I want wheels on the ground in Oregon in 12 hours. "Target?" A gravelly voice responded through the speaker. "The Kane property. Sanctuary 12 is active and uncontained," Silas said, rising from his desk and walking over to a large digital map of the United States. He zoomed in on the dense green expanse of southern Oregon. The primary asset is deceased. His assets, however, are now in play. He cut the connection and stared at the map. His mind was already working 3 steps ahead, calculating routes, kill zones, and extraction points. He felt no thrill, no fear, no hatred for his quarry. This was not a hunt. It was a hostile takeover. He knew the layout of Alistair's house better than its new owner. He knew the surrounding terrain. He knew the pack had been dormant for decades, that they would be disoriented, their instincts raw and unhoned. This would be easy. A quick, brutal, and exquisitely profitable extermination. While Leo was grappling with the moral and existential crisis of his new reality, a far more tangible and deadly reality was already in motion. A black, unmarked cargo plane was being loaded in the Nevada heat. Inside, a team of silent, efficient killers checked their weapons, their faces hidden behind ballistic masks. They were not hunting monsters. They were on their way to a harvest. And Silas, their cold, calculating leader, would be joining them. He never missed a chance to oversee a major acquisition personally. The news report hadn't just been a flare. It was a dinner bell. The revelation of Fenn's transgression sent a tremor through the fragile peace of the sanctuary. The scent of fresh blood clinging to the young wolf's fur was a powerful intoxicant, awakening a primal craving in the others. The atmosphere in the basement turned tense, charged with a low, rumbling energy. Leo could feel it from the top of the stairs, a rising tide of instinct threatening to overwhelm the tentative order he had established. He knew he had to act. To ignore this challenge would be to surrender his newfound authority before it had even taken root. He descended into the crypt, the iron-bound journal clutched in his hand like a shield. The pack watched him, their glowing eyes following his every move. Fenn stood in the center of the room, puffed up with arrogance, licking the last traces of the cow's blood from his chops. He met Leo's gaze with open defiance. Leo's heart hammered, but he forced himself to stand tall. He was painfully aware of his own physical inadequacy. He was a man of code and keyboards, facing a creature of fang and claw that could tear him in half without a thought. He couldn't win a physical confrontation, but the journal had told him of another kind of power, a power that resided not in muscle, but in the bloodline, the inherent authority of the Keeper. "You broke the law," Leo said, his voice quiet but carrying an unnatural weight in the stone chamber. Fen let out a contemptuous snort, a puff of hot air. "I fed," he snarled, his voice a low, guttural rumble. "As a wolf should, not on the frozen scraps of a dead man." "You hunted in the open," Leo countered, taking a step forward. "You brought danger to this house, to this pack. The first law is not a choice, it's our survival. You shall not draw the eyes of man." He was paraphrasing from the journal, the words feeling both foreign and deeply familiar on his tongue. The eyes of soft prey and their weaker keepers. Fen scoffed, taking a challenging step toward Leo. He was bigger, stronger, a coiled spring of predatory violence. "The old ways are forgotten. The old Keeper grew weak. And you are nothing. A pale imitation who smells of the city and fear." This was it, the moment of truth. Fear was a cold knot in Leo's stomach, but something else was rising alongside it, a hot, electric anger, a protective instinct for the entire pack, not just the insolent youth in front of him. He saw the path Fen was on, a path that led to fire and silver and the destruction of them all. "I am your alpha," Leo said, and this time the strange, low vibration he had felt earlier in his chest erupted into his voice. It dropped an octave, resonating with a power that was not his own, a command that vibrated in the very air of the tomb. "And you will kneel." Fen froze mid-step, a look of shock crossing his lupine features. He tried to resist, his muscles bunching, a defiant growl forming in his throat. But he couldn't. It was as if his own body had betrayed him. An invisible, irresistible force pressed down on him, forcing his legs to buckle. He fought it, his body trembling with the strain, a whine of frustration and disbelief escaping his muzzle. But the command was absolute. With a final shuddering groan, he collapsed, his front legs folding, his head forced down until his chin touched the dusty stone floor. He was prostrate, utterly and humiliatingly defeated, not by a blow but by a word. A collective gasp went through the other werewolves. They had seen alphas assert dominance before through vicious, bloody fights. They had never seen this. This was a different kind of power, more profound and more terrifying. Leo himself was shaken, a tremor running through him from the force of what he had just unleashed. He felt a strange tingling in his hands, and a small cut on his palm from the journal's lock, which had been bleeding sluggishly, had already sealed itself over. He ignored it, his focus entirely on the subjugated wolf. He walked over and stood above Fen. "The law keeps us alive," he said, his voice returning to normal, but now imbued with an unshakable authority. "It is the shield that lets us exist. You endangered every one of us for a taste of blood. It will not happen again." He looked to the others. "This is our sanctuary, and I am its keeper. My law is the only law." Vexa, who had watched the entire exchange with shrewd amber eyes, slowly padded forward. She stopped beside Leo, looked down at the humiliated Fen, and then back up at Leo. She dipped her head, not in the desperate submission of before, but in a gesture of renewed, solid loyalty. She was no longer just accepting the bloodline, she was accepting the leader. In that moment, she saw not just Alistair's descendant, but a true alpha, one who could lead them with more than just instinct and brute force. Fen remained on the floor, trembling with a mixture of rage and shock. He had not been beaten. He had been commanded. His very nature had been turned against him by this soft-skinned newcomer. The contempt was gone, replaced by a grudging, fearful respect, and a seed of resentment that would smolder long after the confrontation was over. Leo had proven his authority, but he had also created a volatile element within his own ranks. The scavengers did not announce their arrival with sirens or roaring engines. They descended on the small Oregon town like a silent, creeping plague. They moved in unmarked black SUVs with tinted windows, their faces clean-shaven, their clothes the unassuming khaki and denim of park rangers or surveyors. They were ghosts, melting into the background. Silas had established a temporary command post in a rented vacation cabin 5 miles from Leo's property, a hub of whirring servers and encrypted communications. Their professionalism was chilling. One team, posing as insurance adjusters, visited the Miller farm, taking their own samples and analyzing the attack vector. Another, disguised as sociologists from a university, interviewed locals at the town's only diner, gently probing for any stories about the reclusive old man, Alistair, or any strange sightings in the woods. They moved with a quiet, terrifying efficiency. Meanwhile, high above, a silent drone with a thermal imaging camera circled the Kane property. It painted a picture for Silas on his tablet. 13 distinct heat signatures. 12 were densely clustered in the basement, their body temperatures abnormally high, the telltale sign of lupine sapiens metabolism. The 13th was upstairs, human normal. The new alpha, unprepared, unaware. "Perimeter teams, deploy sensors," Silas ordered into his comms. "I want a complete net. Nothing gets in or out without us knowing. Strike Team Alpha, prep for a breach on my signal. Target the primary structure. Use incendiary rounds on the lower level. We'll flush them out." Leo, however, was not as unaware as Silas assumed. The confrontation with Fenn had sharpened his senses in ways he was only beginning to understand. The forest no longer felt silent. It was alive with information. He could hear the crunch of a deer's hoof on pine needles a quarter-mile away. He could smell the subtle change in the air that signaled an approaching rainstorm. And now he could sense a new wrongness in the woods. A cold, disciplined presence that felt utterly alien. The journal was his guide. Alistair had anticipated this, had mapped out the property's weaknesses and potential enemy tactics. "They will come not as a mob, but as surgeons," he had written. "They will cut you off, surround you, and use the sanctuary against you, turning it from a shelter into a tomb." "We have to see what we're up against," Leo said to Vexa, who had become his constant shadow, his second in command. He chose 2 other wolves, a pair of swift, gray-furred twins named Kale and Lyra, and prepared to venture out. They moved at dusk, using a hidden exit Alistair had built, a tunnel that led from the back of the cellar into a dense thicket 100 yards from the house. Leo, armed with a powerful flashlight and his grandfather's old hunting knife, felt a strange fusion of his old and new selves. His urban mind, accustomed to navigating concrete jungles, was now processing tactical data from a preternatural source. They hadn't gone 300 yards when Kale froze, letting out a low growl. Leo silenced him with a hand gesture. He strained his ears and heard it too, the faint rhythmic click-click-click of something mechanical. He peered through the dense underbrush and saw them. 2 figures in dark tactical gear, methodically planting a small spiked device into the earth. A motion sensor. Before Leo could formulate a plan, a twig snapped under Lyra's paw. It was a small sound, but in the tense silence, it was as loud as a gunshot. The 2 scavengers spun around, their rifles snapping up, weapon-mounted lights cutting brilliant white swaths through the gloom. "Contact!" One of them hissed into his radio. The world exploded into chaos. The scavengers opened fire, not with normal bullets, but with rounds that shrieked through the air, trailing silver sparks. One clipped Cale's shoulder, and the werewolf roared in pain as the silver core bullet burned his flesh like acid. Leo's mind went into overdrive. Direct confrontation was suicide. "Back! To the tunnel!" he yelled, his voice a raw command. But the scavengers were between them and their escape route. Thinking fast, Leo remembered a detail from Alistair's maps, a small, marshy creek bed 50 feet to their left. This way. He scrambled toward it, Vexa and the injured Kyle at his heels, Lyra providing cover with furious, snarling lunges that kept the mercenaries at a distance. They half ran, half slid down the muddy bank into the shallow, ice-cold water. The creek would mask their scent and heat signature. It was a desperate gamble, a trick he'd seen in a movie once, but it was all he had. They hunkered down behind a fallen log as the scavengers' light swept the area above them. "Lost them?" One of the men growled in frustration. "Thermals blanking on the water. They're gone." "Command! This is Picket 2, the other said into his comms. "We made contact. 3 subjects. 1 confirmed hit. They vanished. Repeat, they have vanished." Leo waited, his heart pounding, the icy water seeping into his boots, until the sound of the mercenaries moving off faded into the distance. Kyle was whimpering, the silver burn on his shoulder sizzling like a chemical fire. They limped back to the sanctuary under the cover of total darkness, shaken and wounded. The truth of his grandfather's warning was now terrifyingly clear. The house was no longer a fortress. The scavengers were here. They were professionals. They were armed with silver, and they had sealed the perimeter. Their home was now a cage, and Silas, the hunter, was closing the door. The sanctuary had become a pressure cooker. The scent of Cale's silver-burned wound filled the stone crypt, a constant, agonizing reminder of the enemy camped just beyond their walls. The pack was on edge, a low growl a permanent fixture in the air. Fen, in particular, paced restlessly, his earlier arrogance replaced by a sullen, simmering rage directed at the unseen enemy. He saw the wound, smelled the silver, and for the first time, understood the nature of the threat Leo had warned of. Leo knew they were living on borrowed time. The scavengers were methodical. They would probe, test, and then, when they were certain of the layout and their quarry's strength, they would strike with overwhelming force. Fighting them here in a house they had already surrounded would be a massacre. Alistair's fortress was designed for hiding, not for an all-out war against a technologically superior foe. Desperate, Leo turned back to the iron journal, poring over the last few chapters, the ink faded and the pages worn thin. His grandfather had written about a final contingency, a plan of last resort he called the Long Walk, or the Path to the Great North. If the sanctuary falls, if the Keeper's line is broken, or if the world presses in too close, there is only one path left, Alistair wrote. Not to fight, for that is a war we cannot win, but to vanish. The Great North is not a place, but a promise. The endless, untamed wilderness of Canada. Forests so vast a pack can run for a week and never cross a road. Mountains so high they touch the sky. There, a pack can live as nature intended. Free. But the journey is a blade's edge. To fail is to be erased. The entry included a series of hand-drawn maps, layered with notes on hunting grounds, human population densities, and the patrol routes of park rangers and border guards. It was a desperate, almost impossible plan. To lead a pack of 12 werewolves on a 700-mile exodus through the hostile territory of the Pacific Northwest. The idea was insane, and it was their only hope. He gathered the pack in the main room of the house, the first time they had all been assembled upstairs. He laid the journal on the great oak table, its pages open to the maps of the Great North. "The hunters are outside," Leo began, his voice echoing in the tense silence. "They have us trapped. If we stay here, we will die. Kyle's wound is proof of that. They have silver and they have numbers." He tapped the map. "But my grandfather had a plan for this. A way out. We leave. We run. We head north to the great forests in Canada, a place where we can be free." The pack shifted, a murmur of growls and uneasy whines rippling through them. It was Fen who spoke first, his voice a low rumble. "Run? We are the predators. We should tear them apart, spill their blood on our own land." "And how many of us would die in the attempt?" Vexa countered, her amber eyes sharp as glass. She gestured with her snout to Kyle, who was lying by the fire, his breath coming in ragged pants. "Their weapons burn us. They are not mindless prey, Fen. They are hunters like us. To fight them on their terms is to walk into a slaughterhouse." "Vexa is right," Leo said, his authority holding them. "We don't win by fighting their war. We win by refusing to fight it. We will move by night, through the wildest parts of the land. We will hunt on the move. We will become ghosts. It's what we were made for." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each wolf. He saw fear, uncertainty, but also a flicker of hope. The promise of freedom was a powerful lure to creatures who had been locked in a stone box for a generation. The plan shifted the very nature of their struggle. The claustrophobic horror of the siege was about to give way to the desperate high-stakes tension of a chase. Their preparation was swift and primitive. They would take nothing but themselves. Leo packed a small, rugged backpack with the iron journal, a water purifier, a fire-starting kit, his tablet loaded with offline maps, and the last of his energy bars. As the last light of day faded from the sky, Leo stood by the back door, the pack assembled behind him. He could feel the enemy's presence, the invisible net of technology and malice they had woven around the property. "Tonight we show them what it means to hunt a shadow," Leo said softly. He gave Vexa a nod. Using the same hidden tunnel as before, they slipped out of the sanctuary one by one, melting into the deep twilight of the Oregon forest. The house, their home and their prison, was left behind, a dark, silent silhouette against the star-dusted sky. Their long walk had begun. Each step took them further from their cage and deeper into the jaws of the wilderness, with a relentless predator on their trail. The road movie had begun, and the price of failure was extinction. The world became a blur of motion and shadow. The days bled together into a grueling cycle of hiding and running. The first week was a hell of aching muscles for Leo and a constant gnawing hunger for the pack. By the end of the second week, their journey had become a grim routine, a rhythm of survival dictated by the setting and rising of the sun. For nearly 3 weeks, they were creatures of the night, a phantom pack flowing through the veins of the wilderness. The dynamic of Leo's existence had been completely rewritten. By day, they found the deepest, most inaccessible parts of the forest to hide. Leo, gaunt and hardened, would huddle with his tablet, its screen dimmed, cross-referencing satellite imagery with Alistair's hand-drawn maps, planning the next night's leg of the journey. He charted a course through a network of national parks and state forests, a green corridor that bypassed towns and highways. By night, his other self took over. His senses, honed by a strange alchemy of adrenaline and ancestral blood, guided them. He could smell the distant rain, hear the subtle shift of rock that signaled an unstable slope, and feel the predatory gaze of an owl high above. He ran with them, his city-softened body now corded with wiry muscle, pushed onward by a primal energy he didn't know he possessed. The pack, in turn, provided for them. Each night, a small hunting party led by Vexa would silently detach, returning with a deer, enough to sustain their massive frames. The raw, bloody hunts were a necessity that tightened the knot of fear in Leo's gut. The scent of blood was a beacon, and he knew their pursuers were never far behind. The scavengers were relentless. Silas, enraged at having his quarry slip through his perfectly laid net, pushed his teams to their limits. They traded their silent approach for speed and aggression. Convoys of black, all-terrain jeeps roared down logging roads. Drones with infrared scanners swept the mountainsides. Silas had even put a bounty out, paying off local hunters and trackers for any sign of a pack of unusually large wolves. The chase was a brutal chess match played across a board of mountains and rivers. One night, while crossing a shallow river, the pack was spotted by a drone. Within minutes, the sound of engines echoed through the valley. Leo, thinking fast, directed the pack into the rapids, the churning ice-cold water masking their heat signatures just long enough for them to scramble up the far bank and disappear into the labyrinthine forest before the scavengers' searchlights could lock onto them. They were close to the Canadian border, a mere 20 miles, but it was the most dangerous 20 miles of their lives. Silas, knowing his prey was about to escape his grasp, was funneling all his resources to cut them off. The final confrontation came at a place Alistair's map had marked with a skull and crossbones: the Devil's Jaw Bridge. It was an old, decommissioned logging bridge that spanned a 200-foot deep canyon. It was their only way across. On the other side lay Canada and freedom. But as they approached, they saw the trap. Headlights from 3 jeeps blocked the far end of the bridge. On their side, more lights flickered to life, cutting off their retreat. They were pinned. Silas stepped out of the lead jeep, a high-powered rifle resting easily in his hands. "It's over, Keeper," his voice boomed through a megaphone, unnaturally loud in the pristine wilderness. "You have nowhere left to run. Surrender the assets, and I might let you walk away." Leo looked at his pack. They were cornered, exhausted, their fur matted with mud and grime. He saw the fight in their eyes, but he also saw the sheer overwhelming odds. "Vexa," he said, his voice low and urgent. "When I move, you take them. Don't stop. Don't look back. Get them across." "Leo, no!" she growled, a sound of protest. "That's an order from your alpha," he said, and the power in his voice made her flinch. Before anyone could react, Leo did the last thing anyone expected. He broke from the tree line and sprinted onto the bridge straight toward Silas. "You want an asset?" he screamed, his voice a raw, desperate challenge. "Come and get me." Silas smiled, a thin, cruel line. "Foolish." He raised his rifle. But as Leo ran, something inside him finally broke free. The nascent power he'd felt, the quick healing, the voice of command, it was all just a prelude. A searing heat flooded his veins. His sprint became something more, a loping, impossibly fast gait. His hands clenched and his fingernails thickened and elongated into wicked black claws. His face contorted, his jawline pushing forward, his teeth sharpening. His jacket tore at the shoulders as his muscles bunched and swelled. He wasn't fully wolf, but he was no longer fully human. He was a terrifying hybrid, a creature of pure, desperate rage. He let out a roar that was half human, half wolf, a sound of pure defiance that echoed through the canyon. Silas, momentarily stunned by the transformation, fired. The silver core round tore through Leo's shoulder and the pain was blinding, but he didn't stop. He closed the distance, a whirlwind of fury, and slammed into Silas, sending them both crashing to the deck of the bridge. Seeing their alpha in battle, fighting for them, shattered the pack's hesitation. With a collective, earth-shaking howl, they charged. Vexa led the way, a silver-black thunderbolt. Fen, his earlier resentment burned away and replaced by fierce loyalty, was right beside her. They crashed into the line of scavengers like a tidal wave. It wasn't a battle, it was a storm. The mercenaries, prepared for a tactical firefight, were overwhelmed by the sheer feral power of the pack. But Leo's final command held true. As he wrestled with Silas, pinning the man's rifle arm with strength he didn't know he had, he roared, "Disable! Do not kill!" The pack obeyed. They were a force of nature, breaking limbs, shredding tires, and smashing equipment. They fought not to kill, but to incapacitate, to neutralize the threat without violating their most sacred law. Within minutes, the scavengers were a broken, groaning mess of men scattered amongst their ruined vehicles. Leo stood over Silas, his hybrid form trembling, his own blood dripping onto the mercenary's face. Silas stared up at him, his cold facade finally cracked, showing a glimmer of fear and awe. "This isn't over," Silas rasped. "Yes, it is," Leo said, his voice a guttural growl. He stepped back, turned, and limped toward the other side of the bridge, where his pack was waiting. They were free. They crossed the Devil's Jaw Bridge and didn't look back, melting into the vast, dark expanse of the Canadian wilderness. The sounds of the defeated scavengers, groans of pain, the crackle of a dying engine faded behind them, swallowed by the immense silence of the north. They put another 5 miles between themselves and the border before finally allowing themselves to stop. Cale was the only one with a significant new injury, a deep gash on his leg, but the pack's regenerative abilities were already at work. The bleeding stopped, the flesh slowly knitting itself back together. Leo's own shoulder was a searing agony, the silver bullet having left a nasty, cauterized wound. But the pain was a dull throb compared to the overwhelming sense of relief. It would heal. They had all been wounded on this journey, in one way or another, but they had survived. They were whole. The scavengers were left behind, broken but not destroyed. Leo knew Silas would not forget this humiliation. The Order would rebuild, rearm, and one day they might resume their hunt. But for now, the pack had won something more precious than a battle. They had won a future. They had earned a chance to simply be. As the first hints of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of gray and violet, Leo stood on the edge of a high granite cliff. Below him, a breathtaking panorama unfolded. A sea of green and blue, of endless pine forests stretching to the horizon, dotted with pristine, mirror-like lakes. The air was crisp and clean, so different from the smog of San Francisco, or the tense, hunted air of the Oregon woods. It was the smell of freedom. He reached into his pocket out of habit, his fingers brushing against the smooth, dead screen of his smartphone. The device was useless, a relic from a life that felt like it belonged to another person. His credit cards, his apartment keys, his corporate ID, they were all meaningless artifacts now. He had methodically stripped away every piece of his old identity on the long run north, shedding a skin that no longer fit. He had been Leo Maxwell, a man who built systems out of code. Now he was just Leo, the Alpha, a man responsible for a family of impossible creatures. He looked back at his pack. They were resting, some curled up asleep, others quietly licking their wounds. Vexa sat watching him, her amber eyes soft with a deep, unwavering loyalty. Fen, the once rebellious youth, now stood guard at the edge of the clearing, his gaze sweeping the trees, his posture that of a dedicated sentinel. They were no longer starving. They were no longer hunted. They were tired, but they were home. He had walked away from a 6-figure salary, a promising career, a comfortable life. He had lost everything he had ever worked for. But as he stood on that cliff, watching the sun rise over his new domain, a profound sense of purpose filled him for the first time. He had found something real. Not a house, not a bank account, but a reason to live, a family to protect. His inheritance wasn't the fortified farm in Oregon. It was the 12 souls now resting safely behind him. His human past was a ghost. His future was a wild, unknown territory. He looked at his hands, at the faint scars that were already fading, and felt the wolf within, now a quiet, settled part of him. He was a keeper. He was an alpha. He was home. Their long, difficult path was far from over, but for the first time, it was a path they could walk together in the light.